I stood outside the ballroom for several minutes, trying to calm myself. My hands were shaking, but not because of the wine on my dress. It was because of what had just happened. For years, I had stood beside Ethan through every challenge, every late night, and every setback. Yet in a room full of strangers, he treated me like I meant nothing. I walked to the hotel restroom and cleaned myself as best as I could. Several women who had witnessed the scene offered sympathetic smiles, but nobody knew what to say. Neither did I. My phone began vibrating almost immediately. The first call came from a member of the corporate board. I ignored it. Then another call came. And another. By the time I looked at the screen, I had more than a dozen missed calls and messages. Most people assumed I would react immediately. They expected anger, demands, or some dramatic response. Instead, I sat quietly and thought about everything that had happened over the last few years. The humiliation at the ceremony wasn't the real problem. It was simply the moment that forced me to stop making excuses for Ethan. For too long, I had convinced myself that stress was changing him. I told myself his long work hours explained his distance. I ignored the growing feeling that something inside our marriage was broken. That night, I returned home alone. Ethan didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't even check if I had gotten home safely. Hours passed. Around midnight, I finally received a short message from him. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't concern. It was a simple instruction asking me not to create any problems after the event because important investors were involved. I stared at the message for several seconds. After everything that happened, his biggest concern was protecting his image. That was the moment something inside me changed. I stopped feeling embarrassed. I stopped feeling hurt. Instead, I started seeing things clearly. The man I married and the man Ethan had become were no longer the same person. For the first time in years, I opened a private folder on my laptop containing documents I had never needed before. Financial reports, corporate records, internal communications, information connected to people, decisions, and transactions surrounding Ethan's project. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. And deep down, I already suspected that once I found it, our marriage would never be the same again. As I sat in my home office looking through old memories, I couldn't stop thinking about how different Ethan used to be. When we first met, he was ambitious but humble. He appreciated every opportunity he received. He thanked people who helped him and never acted like he was better than anyone else. Back then, he would come home excited to tell me about his day. We talked about everything. Things slowly changed after he started receiving bigger promotions. At first, the changes were small. He became busier and spent more time at work. I understood that. Success often comes with responsibility. But eventually, work became his entire personality. Every conversation centered around money, business deals, and powerful people he wanted to impress. He started judging others based on their position or influence. The kindness that once attracted me to him seemed to disappear. The more successful he became, the less interested he seemed in our marriage. Business dinners replaced date nights. Work trips replaced family vacations. Even when he was home, his attention was somewhere else. Then Natalie Brooks entered the picture. She joined his team a few years earlier and quickly became one of the people he spent the most time with. At first, I didn't think much about it. Assistants often work closely with executives. But over time, their relationship began to make me uncomfortable. Natalie seemed to be present at nearly every event, every meeting, and every trip. Whenever I asked simple questions about her role, Ethan became defensive. He accused me of overthinking. He said I was imagining problems that didn't exist. One evening, I told him I felt like he was pushing me out of his life. Instead of listening, he laughed. He said I was being insecure and jealous of a woman who worked for him. That conversation stayed with me for a long time. Not because of what he said, but because of how easily he dismissed my feelings. After that, I tried harder to save our marriage. I suggested counseling. I planned weekends together. I made efforts to reconnect. Every attempt was met with excuses or delays. Meanwhile, Ethan continued moving further away emotionally. I started noticing little things that didn't add up. Unexpected schedule changes. Secretive phone calls. Stories that seemed incomplete. Nothing was enough to prove anything. But the feeling in my heart kept growing. The trust between us was fading. Looking back, I think I knew our marriage was in trouble long before the signing ceremony. That night wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was simply the moment that forced me to stop pretending everything was fine. For years, I had been trying to hold our marriage together by myself. And I was finally starting to realize that Ethan had stopped trying a long time ago. There was something about my life that almost nobody knew. Even after 10 years of marriage, Ethan never knew the full story. My grandfather, Richard Bennett, spent decades building one of the most respected investment groups in the country. He believed wealth should be protected carefully and managed responsibly. Before he passed away, he created a trust for future generations of our family. When I inherited my portion, I made a decision that surprised many people. I chose not to build my identity around money. I didn't buy luxury cars. I didn't attend exclusive social events. I didn't introduce myself by talking about family wealth. I wanted people to know me for who I was, not what I owned. That included Ethan. When we started dating, I never mentioned the trust. I wanted a relationship based on honesty and character rather than financial advantages. As our relationship became serious, I considered telling him many times. But every time I planned to bring it up, something stopped me. Part of me wanted to know how he would treat me if he believed I had nothing to offer except love and support. For years, I believed I had my answer. Now I wasn't so sure. The trust itself was managed quietly through legal representatives and financial advisors. I rarely became involved in daily operations. Most decisions were handled professionally without requiring my direct participation. However, some situations required my approval. The corporation connected to Ethan's project happened to be one of them. My voting rights were significant enough that board members often contacted me before major decisions. Normally, I reviewed reports, signed documents when necessary, and allowed experienced executives to handle the rest. But after what happened at the ceremony, things felt different. The morning after the event, my phone started ringing again. This time I answered. One board member asked if I was aware of growing concerns surrounding Ethan's division. Another asked whether I wanted additional information before upcoming reviews. A third requested a private meeting. The conversations immediately caught my attention. Until that moment, I had intentionally kept my personal life separate from corporate matters. Now those two worlds were starting to collide. Over the next few days, confidential reports began arriving in my inbox. Some focused on financial details. Others highlighted internal concerns that had been raised months earlier. Nothing had been fully investigated yet, but enough questions existed to make several board members nervous. For the first time, I seriously considered becoming involved. Not because of anger, not because I wanted revenge, but because I suddenly realized that my responsibility extended beyond my marriage. Thousands of employees, investors, and business partners depended on honest leadership. If problems existed, ignoring them would help nobody. As I reviewed another stack of documents late one evening, I understood that a choice was approaching. Soon, I would have to decide whether to remain silent or finally use the authority I had spent years keeping hidden. Once I decided to look deeper, the truth started appearing faster than I expected. At first, I focused only on the business concerns mentioned in the reports. I wanted facts, not assumptions. I wanted to understand exactly what was happening before making any decisions. The more information I reviewed, the more uncomfortable I became. Several company expenses seemed unusual. Certain travel costs did not match official schedules. There were payments connected to events that never appeared on business calendars. Individually, none of these details seemed serious. Together, they created a troubling pattern. I asked a trusted attorney to help me review everything carefully. A few days later, he presented additional records that raised even more questions. Some of those records included communications connected to Ethan and Natalie. What I found shattered any remaining doubts. Their relationship was not professional. It had not been professional for a very long time. The evidence showed months of secret meetings, private trips, and plans that extended far beyond business matters. For several minutes, I simply sat in silence. Part of me felt relieved to finally know the truth. Another part of me felt completely heartbroken. I had spent so much time questioning my instincts, wondering if I was being unfair. Now I knew I had been right all along. But the affair was only part of the betrayal. As more documents surfaced, another disturbing picture began to emerge. Ethan had been making decisions that blurred the line between personal interests and company resources. Money was being spent in ways that could eventually create serious problems if anyone looked closely enough. The situation was becoming bigger than a failing marriage. Then came the discovery that hurt the most. Among the records were messages exchanged between Ethan and people he trusted. In those conversations, he spoke about me in ways I never imagined. He described me as useless. He claimed I contributed nothing to his success. He joked that I was living off the life he had built. Each message felt like a punch to the chest. I thought about the years I spent supporting him through difficult moments. The sacrifices, the patience, the loyalty. To learn that he viewed me that way made the pain far deeper than anything that happened at the ceremony. That night, I barely slept. I kept asking myself how someone could accept so much support while showing so little respect. By morning, however, my sadness had started turning into clarity. I wasn't interested in arguing with Ethan. I wasn't interested in confronting Natalie. I wasn't interested in emotional scenes or public accusations. The facts already existed. The evidence already existed. The truth didn't need my anger to make it stronger. So I made a decision. I would stay quiet. I would remain patient. And I would allow Ethan to face the consequences created by his own choices. For the first time, I stopped protecting him. Whatever happened next would be the result of everything he had done himself. A week passed before the board meeting. During that time, I kept my distance and focused on reviewing information with my advisors. I did not contact Ethan. He barely contacted me either. It was clear that his attention remained fixed on the project he believed would take his career to an entirely new level. The meeting had been scheduled months earlier. According to the agenda, senior executives and board members would review the final stage of the project before moving forward. Everyone expected it to be a celebration, especially Ethan. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived early through a private entrance and joined several board members in a conference room before the session began. We discussed procedures, reviewed reports, and prepared for the presentation. Nobody mentioned my personal connection to Ethan. Today was about facts and responsibilities. Nothing else. About 30 minutes later, the executives began arriving. Through the glass wall of the conference area, I noticed Ethan walking confidently toward the boardroom. Natalie was beside him carrying presentation materials. Both of them looked completely relaxed. From their expressions, it was obvious they expected everything to go according to plan. As more people entered, conversations filled the room. Then the meeting officially began. Ethan stood at the front and started presenting the project. He spoke with confidence and certainty. Several board members listened carefully while taking notes. The presentation lasted nearly 40 minutes. When he finished, he looked satisfied. He seemed certain approval was only minutes away. Then one of the directors requested a short recess before voting. That was when I entered the room. The moment I stepped inside, several executives immediately stood to greet me. Others shook my hand and welcomed me warmly. I noticed Ethan's expression change almost instantly. At first, he looked confused, then surprised, then concerned. Natalie looked equally shocked. Neither of them seemed to understand why so many senior people were treating me with such respect. I calmly walked toward the main conference table. A chair had been reserved for me near the board members. As I sat down, one of the directors formally introduced me for the benefit of those who were unaware of my position. He explained my role within the trust and my voting authority regarding major corporate decisions. The room became completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan stared at me as if he were seeing a stranger. For the first time, he understood that I was not simply attending the meeting. I was one of the people helping decide its outcome. The confidence he carried into the room was gone. Questions filled his face. Questions I had no intention of answering at that moment. I remained calm and professional. This was not about personal feelings. This was business. The meeting resumed, and everyone returned to their seats. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The certainty Ethan brought into that room had disappeared. And for the first time, he realized that the future he had been counting on was no longer entirely in his hands. After the meeting resumed, one of the audit committee members requested permission to present additional information. The room immediately became serious. A large screen displayed several reports that had not been included in Ethan's presentation. The auditors explained that they had recently completed a review of records connected to his division. At first, the findings seemed technical, but as they continued, the concerns became much more significant. Certain financial projections presented to investors appeared incomplete. Several risks connected to the project had not been fully disclosed. There were also questions about spending decisions that required further examination. No one accused Ethan of anything illegal. Not yet. However, the auditors made it clear that important questions still needed answers before any final approval could move forward. Ethan quickly stood up to defend himself. He argued that the project remained strong and that the concerns were being exaggerated. He insisted that every major decision had been made with good intentions. For a while, some people seemed willing to listen. Then the auditors presented additional documents. The room grew quieter with every page. Each report added another layer of concern. Several board members who had originally supported immediate approval began asking difficult questions. The discussion continued for more than 2 hours. Throughout the entire process, I said very little. When I finally spoke, I focused only on one issue: protecting shareholders. I explained that any project involving this level of investment required complete transparency. If questions existed, they needed answers before anyone could responsibly move forward. There was no anger in my voice. No personal attacks. Only facts. Eventually, the board voted to freeze key portions of the deal until a full investigation could be completed. The decision sent a wave of shock through the room. For months, many executives had assumed approval was guaranteed. Now everything was uncertain. As people began leaving the boardroom, I noticed a major change in Natalie. Earlier, she had stayed close to Ethan throughout the day. Now she seemed uncomfortable. Instead of speaking with him, she spent most of her time talking to attorneys and senior managers. When reporters and industry contacts started hearing rumors about the delayed approval, pressure increased even further. Within days, conversations about the situation spread through executive circles. Questions replaced praise. Concern replaced excitement. Ethan suddenly found himself under a level of scrutiny he had never experienced before. For the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine worry in his eyes. Not confidence. Not arrogance. Worry. As the investigation moved forward, he began understanding something he had ignored for years. Success had convinced him that he could handle everything alone. He had pushed away advice. He had dismissed warnings. He had underestimated people who cared about him. And now the support system he once took for granted was no longer standing between him and the consequences of his decisions. The foundation beneath his career was beginning to crack. And there was nothing he could do to stop the process once it had started. Over the following weeks, Ethan's situation continued getting worse. What surprised him most was not the investigation. It was how quickly people around him began changing. For years, he had been surrounded by executives, business contacts, and industry leaders who constantly praised him. His phone was always ringing. Invitations arrived every week. People wanted meetings, lunches, and conversations. Now those same people suddenly seemed unavailable. Calls went unanswered. Emails received short replies or no reply at all. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. One by one, the people who once celebrated his success quietly disappeared. I watched from a distance as it happened. No one needed to tell me what was going on. Many of those relationships had never been genuine. They were built on power and opportunity. Once those things became uncertain, loyalty disappeared with them. Natalie was changing too. At first, she appeared supportive whenever questions about the project surfaced. But as attention around the investigation increased, her behavior shifted. She started protecting herself. In conversations with attorneys and executives, she claimed many decisions had been Ethan's responsibility alone. Whenever difficult questions arose, she seemed eager to create distance between herself and the situation. The partnership they once appeared so confident about was beginning to crack. At the same time, more employees started speaking openly. People who had remained silent for years suddenly felt comfortable sharing their experiences. Some described being ignored during important discussions. Others talked about how Ethan dismissed concerns whenever someone disagreed with him. Several former team members recalled moments when their work was overlooked while Ethan took credit for successful outcomes. None of these stories created new problems by themselves. But together they painted a picture that was very different from the image Ethan had carefully built throughout his career. The respected executive many people admired was becoming harder to recognize. As more information surfaced, fewer people rushed to defend him. Even those who once considered him a mentor stayed quiet. One evening, Ethan unexpectedly called me. The confidence that usually filled his voice was gone. For the first time in years, he sounded tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. He talked about people abandoning him. He complained that nobody was standing beside him when he needed support. As I listened, I couldn't ignore the irony. For years, I had experienced that same loneliness inside our marriage. I knew what it felt like to reach out and receive nothing in return. I knew what it felt like to be overlooked and dismissed. Now Ethan was facing a version of that reality himself. The difference was simple. My loneliness had come from loving someone who stopped valuing me. His loneliness was coming from discovering that many people had only valued what he could provide. And that realization seemed to hurt him more than anything else happening around him. After everything that had happened, I knew there was one decision I could no longer postpone. I filed for divorce. It was not an emotional decision made in anger. In many ways, I had already accepted the end of my marriage long before the paperwork was submitted. The filing simply made it official. My attorneys prepared everything carefully. I instructed them to focus only on facts and documentation. I had no interest in turning the process into a public fight. There would be no dramatic accusations. No attempts to embarrass Ethan. No unnecessary conflict. The truth was already strong enough on its own. When Ethan received the papers, he immediately requested a meeting. At first, I considered declining. Eventually, I agreed. We met in a private conference room. The man sitting across from me looked very different from the confident executive who had once believed he controlled every situation. He seemed exhausted. For several minutes, he talked about mistakes. He admitted he had handled many things poorly. He blamed pressure, stress, and the demands of his career. He said he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Then he apologized. It was the apology I had wanted to hear for a long time. The problem was that it arrived too late. I listened quietly until he finished. Then I told him something simple. Stress does not force people to betray trust. Success does not force people to disrespect those who support them. Those are choices, and every choice carries consequences. After that conversation, I never questioned my decision again. As the divorce moved forward, additional financial records became part of the legal review process. Several business decisions that had already raised concerns received even greater attention. Professional investigators and attorneys examined transactions, approvals, and internal communications. The findings created new problems for Ethan's reputation. People who had once defended him found it harder and harder to explain the growing list of concerns surrounding his leadership. Meanwhile, Natalie finally made her own decision. She resigned from her position and completely separated herself from Ethan. There were no emotional goodbyes, no public statements. She simply left. The future she had once imagined no longer existed. Without the success and influence that had attracted her, there was nothing keeping her connected to him. By the time the divorce neared completion, Ethan had lost far more than he expected. His marriage was ending. His professional standing had been severely damaged. Many opportunities he once considered guaranteed had disappeared. As for me, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Peace. Not happiness yet. Not relief. Just peace. For years, I had carried the weight of trying to save a relationship that only one person was fighting for. Now that burden was gone. The chapter was closing. And for the first time, I was ready to move forward without looking back. After some time passed, the situation that once felt private slowly became known across the industry. People who had never been involved in the original events started learning details through official reports, internal reviews, and professional discussions among business leaders. At first, many found it difficult to believe. The idea that I held a significant ownership position in the corporation surprised even experienced executives. Most people had assumed I was simply connected through marriage and nothing more. That misunderstanding changed quickly once the facts became clear. What surprised many even more was not just my position, but how everything had been handled. There had been no public arguments, no emotional reactions, no attempts to damage reputations. Only careful decisions based on responsibility and procedure. Senior board members openly expressed respect for the way the situation had been managed. They described it as calm, controlled, and focused on protecting long-term stability. Investors also began responding differently once the full picture was understood. Confidence in leadership decisions increased because the process had been transparent and structured. They saw that difficult choices had been made without emotional interference, even when personal connections were involved. Ethan's reputation, however, continued to decline. As more information became public within professional circles, the narrative around him changed completely. He was no longer viewed as a rising executive with strong potential. Instead, Discussions often focused on how quickly things had fallen apart once accountability was introduced. People pointed to patterns in decision-making that showed poor judgment and excessive confidence. Some described it as ego overriding responsibility. Others referred to it as a lack of awareness of consequences. In many conversations, his career was used as an example of how fast success can collapse when leadership loses balance. At the same time, my role in the situation was viewed very differently. There was recognition that I had remained calm even under personal pressure. Many professionals noted that I had focused on structure and responsibility rather than emotion or retaliation. That approach became one of the reasons trust in my leadership continued to grow. I never gave interviews. I never made public statements. I never tried to explain my decisions beyond what was necessary in formal settings. There was no need to. The facts spoke clearly on their own. Over time, one thing became obvious to everyone watching the situation from the outside. The outcome was not shaped by anger or revenge. It was shaped by accountability. And accountability did not require loud actions or dramatic responses. It only required truth, patience, and consistency. Ethan's downfall became a lesson discussed quietly in boardrooms and executive meetings. Not because of what was said about him, but because of what was revealed through his own actions. Meanwhile, my name was no longer associated with silence or support alone. It was associated with clarity and leadership in moments when everything was at risk of falling apart. A year later, my life had taken a direction I never could have imagined during those difficult months. Everything around me felt different, not because the past was gone, but because it no longer controlled me. I had taken on new responsibilities within the business world, and my influence had grown steadily. Decisions that once felt overwhelming now felt natural. I trusted myself in ways I never had before. Outside of work, I finally built a home that reflected stability and peace. It was not about luxury or status. It was about comfort, safety, and starting over in a place where I could breathe without pressure. Every corner of that new home reminded me that I had rebuilt something from pieces that once felt broken. The people close to me noticed the change. Friends who had known me for years said I seemed calmer. Family members said I spoke with more confidence. Some even said I looked lighter, as if a long weight had been lifted. They were right. What I had gone through had changed me, but not in a way that destroyed me. It strengthened me. One afternoon, I received a message from Ethan. I had not heard from him in a long time, and I did not feel any urgency when I saw his name appear. I opened it without expectation. His words were direct. He admitted that the way he treated me had been wrong. He said he finally understood the damage caused by his actions. He expressed regret for everything that had happened, especially the moment he had publicly humiliated me. Then he asked if there was any possibility of starting over. I read the message slowly. There was no anger inside me anymore. No sadness either. Only clarity. I responded politely but firmly. I told him that some choices cannot be undone by apologies alone, and that some paths, once broken, do not return to what they were before. After sending the reply, I put my phone aside and sat in silence for a while. I thought about everything that had led to this point, not with bitterness, but with understanding. I realized something important that day. Revenge was never about making someone suffer. It was never about proving a point or watching someone fall. The real change came from something much quieter. It came from choosing myself when I was no longer being valued. From stepping away instead of staying in something that no longer respected me. From rebuilding a life that did not depend on someone else's approval. As I looked around my new home, I finally understood the full truth. The woman Ethan once humiliated had never been powerless. She had simply been patient. And when she finally stopped waiting for respect that never came, she discovered she had been holding the strength to rebuild everything all along. Now, walking forward into the future, I no longer looked back at what was lost. I looked at what I had become instead.